Welcome to HortTube. My name is Jim Putnam. This is the Sunday gardening question and answer video that I have been doing for a while now on Sundays. The first Sunday of every month I do a subscriber Sunday video where subscribers send in photos that I include in the video. The rest of the month I am doing these question and answer videos as long as we're getting good questions, and this week we have gotten really good questions. So I'll continue to do these as long as I feel like I'm helping the group. I've also used these videos to update some goings on for those of you. Again, every time I say that I am actually moving, there are more people that are going to hear it in that video and be surprised by it. But I am moving to Raleigh, to a much smaller lot, but it is an absolutely perfect 2/10 of an acre rectangle that's almost completely flat and pretty much completely open. It's going to give a lot of opportunity. When I started landscaping in this yard, I had already been here for 20 years, and so a lot of the things that I would have done initially weren't seen. So I'm going to be going in there. We're going to be pH testing. We're going to be soil testing all around, and I'm going to be able to show you soil test and what to, how to work with the information that you would get back in a soil test, which would answer a lot of the questions that I get on these videos, on these question and answer videos, honestly. And so we'll be able to start from the beginning. What would you do if you were moving into a new house? How would you handle it? How would you change the soil? How would you amend the soil? And just getting started. And so I hope that all that is going to be helpful, and it's going to be, like I say, a lot of these questions that I get every week, I feel like will be answered in those series of videos that will start sometime later this fall. I'm also traveling before that, and I announced some places that I'm speaking this fall last week, and that's on my Facebook page under events if you're interested in any of those. 2 in North Carolina, 1 in South Carolina, 1 in Georgia so far, and I'm actually heading down to Mobile and near New Orleans and Baton Rouge and some other places, and I may do some sort of stop down there as well. So let's get started on the questions. Like I say, really good questions this week. There was one that I wanted to unbox a little more than the others. That'll be later in that'll be the last question I will answer, and it probably will be a fairly long answer because it had a lot of pieces in it that I feel are extremely important. So I may put the timestamp right here for where that question starts, just because it's going to be longer, and I feel like it may be one of the more important things that I have addressed. Okay, somebody asked me about killing Creeping Charlie in their yard, and Creeping Charlie's a little weed. It's about maybe a dollar size, dollar coin size leaf on it that it spreads by rhizome under the ground, and it can be a pretty nasty weed. You tend to typically see it in slightly shadier conditions, sometimes in the full sun, but mostly in at least part shade, typically in soils that don't drain all that well. So doing things for drainage and will be helpful, but then obviously there are chemicals to control it. The place I'm moving to is covered in Creeping Charlie, so you guys are going to get to see me battle Creeping Charlie. You're going to get to see me battle some pretty tough, well-established weeds that have been on this lot for a while. So that will be coming up, but you can spray it. But I mean, when you look at this is something that I'll address in the new place, because I'll be able to show you lots of weeds at one time. Weeds are indicators of other issues, and like I say, with Creeping Charlie, usually it's poor drainage, very flat spaces. Typically you'll see Creeping Charlie growing in. You'll see it growing between curbs and sidewalks, places where it's compacted. A lot of foot traffic has been on it before. So you can use that weed as an indicator of maybe some other things going on in your soil. I'll go through that also at the new house. Somebody asked me about the size of a container to use for their shrubs to overwinter them, and if the size of the container would help in overwintering them. Well, of course, I mean, there's, if you had a car-sized container, that would prevent that container from freezing solid, probably in the South. But really, I would plant something, if you think there's a possibility of the winter hurting this plant, and that's really what we're talking about here. If they were talking about a camellia. Okay, so I'm in zone 7, 7B, and camellias are hardy in zone 7 to 9. So let's say I put a camellia in a container and I put it out here on my sidewalk for the winter time. Well, because the roots are up above the ground, it's actually more like zone 6 or even 5 conditions for the roots of that plant being above the ground. So keep that in mind. If you were in zone 9, heck yeah, you could put a camellia in a container, or even like 8B, you put a camellia in a container, no problem. any size container. Wouldn't really matter. But in, you know, the further north you go, the further you push the area north in the zone. Like if I'm in 7 and the thing only grows up to 7, if I put that in a container, almost certainly it's going to be hurt in the winter without some protection. So the answer to this is, you could find a giant pot which may help you insulate it, but if it got really cold, that giant pot would take away your ability to actually move that plant. And so I would get the biggest container you can get that still allows you to move it into your garage or some other place, or allows you to cover it, or allows you to be able to do something around it to protect that plant. Because if that camellia stays frozen in that container for 2 or 3 nights straight, it'll be dead. You'll almost, in zone 7, any plant that we grow in a nursery here that's only hardy up to our zone, they're going in cold frames for the winter. All these guys around me will use cold frames for those things. The things that are hardy all the way up to zone 5, those guys will leave those out. They may throw some sort of cloth cover on them at some point, but that's kind of how the nurseries are judging it. If it's about 2 zones more cold hardy, they're really not protecting it all that much. If it's like 1 zone more cold hardy, they're throwing a light cover over it. If it's only hardy to the zone they're in, they're protecting it. They're putting it in a cold frame. They may even have some additional types of ways to heat them if they need to. Another one of my long answers. Okay. Somebody asked about planting yucca. They wanted to plant yucca, but they heard it can be invasive and hard to get rid of, and that's true. It will sucker from the roots like crazy. I also get this question on crepe myrtles all the time. People try to remove crepe myrtles and they sucker all over the place. And unfortunately, the only way to control, there's several ways to control suckers. One would be to get rid of the roots, obviously, to be more thorough in your removal of the plant to get all the roots out. That's really difficult, obviously, in a lot of different soil types. Or alternatively, you spray, and there are lots of sucker sprays. There are lots of chemicals available on the shelf at Lowe's and Depot in your local garden center that would, it'll say sucker something, you know, to kill root suckers as they're coming up, and they're for killing the wood. So they're non-selective, so you can't get them on anything else, but you can spray or paint it on suckers, and it will carry it down to the roots and go ahead and kill those roots. Because if you chop them off, you don't actually kill the root, you're going to get more suckers. So denying them light by cutting them off is the third way, and that's typically the way I handle it. This is part of gardening. If you garden, at some point you're going to regret planting something, or you're going to move into a house and cut something down and it's going to sucker for a while. The Carissa hollies, I did a video, I actually want to do another video on this, about removing some shrubs that I had along the sidewalk right here. Those still sucker in that space, those Carissa hollies. They had been there 20 years. I cut suckers off about a week or so ago. The main thing with it is get them quickly, because if they come up for any length of time, they're gathering the sun's energy and they're strengthening those roots below the ground, and adding some more energy to them, giving them another opportunity to sucker again. So the faster you can cut them off, if you choose that method, the better. But yes, yucca will do the same thing that crepe myrtles will do. When you try to remove one, they'll pop up all over the place. Somebody asked about blueprints and blue princess hollies. They had bought some. I actually grew those too for a while. Just wanted some information on them, sun or shade, and how drought tolerant they are. I haven't covered blueprints. It's a great holly. It's a very heavy fruiting hollies. Keep in mind with hollies, even though they'll grow in sun or shade, they will not bloom very well in the shade. And so if you intentionally went out and bought a pair, male and female hollies, just to get berries, put it in the sun for sure, because the more sun, the more flowers, the more flowers, the more fruit. So keep that in mind. At least a half a day sun, maybe all day sun would be even better. And they're super drought tolerant. They're just as drought tolerant as any other holly. Once they're in the ground for 2 years, 3 years, if you're in an area that gets regular rainfall, you're not going to have to worry about them ever. Somebody asked me about pruning fruit tree that a peach that they had dug up from I guess from a seedling or whatever, how to prune. If you're in an area, this will be true, I'm just going to throw this out here on pruning fruit. If you're in an area where that fruit plant grows, so I'm in a state that grows peaches, okay, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Georgia's a peach state. If you're in an area that actually has peaches, almost certainly there's a pruning class at one of the land-grant universities. NC State has a pruning class typically sometime around February for pruning fruit trees, during the time that it's time to prune fruit trees. And if you're wanting information on pruning fruiting plants and fruit trees. Search that on Google for your area, wherever your big horticulture school in your state or in your area is, or agriculture school. They will have a field day somewhere. They've got in the state, they've got a place where they grow some of those fruit plants and fruit trees, and so they're doing experiments for farmers and maybe looking at new varieties, maybe just doing different spray programs, because farmers can't really experiment all that much in their own fields because they have to make a living. The universities typically have programs where they're working on those kinds of things, and maybe not spraying something, or maybe spraying it twice, or maybe whatever. But they, like I say, they have classes, and so look that up. If you're trying to grow a citrus tree in Connecticut, obviously there's not going to be a citrus pruning class probably in Connecticut. So keep that in mind. But again, and then from there, obviously, unfortunately, it's the internet, and that's going to lead into my next, the last one I'm going to answer, and the one I was talking about. I thought was kind of important. But anyway, again, pruning fruit, every type of fruit tree is going to require a different timing. It's going to be based on where you live. I'm in Raleigh, North Carolina, and almost certainly I'm going to prune or treat or fertilize differently, or need additional nutrients. This is another thing that you could learn by going to a local place like that, and asking a professor, or who maybe it's a student running that class or something like that, and ask them, there may be nutrients that are very specific to that fruit plant that are needed in that area that wouldn't be in some other area. Again, that's going to lead into my to my last question here. I had a very long question about doing a new foundation planting in the shaded space, and it's up against a foundation, and the question included putting down gypsum, compost, and then gardening soil, and then tilling it in. And I'm going to tell you why I wouldn't use any of that gardening soil stuff that's sold at Lowe's or Depot, and I'm not picking on anybody, but there's these bags of garden soil that says on the side of it. This stuff would be fine for top dressing garden space, or maybe using as in your container mixes or something like that. But in most soils, that material will stay too wet. Now you can top dress with it, and maybe some of it gets mixed in when you plant, but I would avoid those things called garden soils. Sometimes they have fertilizers in them too, and in my clay planting video that I did a couple years ago, I was really pointing that out, that I wanted to make sure that you guys understand to not buy soil amendments that have fertilizers in them, because it may or may not be the time to actually be putting that fertilizer down. Not telling you not to fertilize, just telling you not to buy those two things combined together. Because if you only use half the bag, and then you want to use the other half the bag in September to plant the plant, well, you don't want Miracle Grow in your soil in September, because it's going to make that plant potentially grow, and then it gets damaged. So don't buy soil mixes that have fertilizers in them. So that's one thing I'll say on that. Compost mixed into the soil is all we need, okay? Unless we have a soil test that tells you something different. I want to say that again. Only use compost in your soil, or maybe pine bark soil conditioner like I use, which is an aged pine bark. It's compost-like, mixed in, but those two things are not going to harm your soils. Don't go over like 10%. We don't want to, especially in a foundation planting, if you mixed 50% compost with the soil that was there, it would end up staying super boggy and super wet, and probably would be anaerobic and would cause you other problems. Plus, you don't want that much moisture near your foundation or your house anyway. We'd like that space to dry out a little bit around our foundation. So keep all those things in mind. Just use compost unless a soil test has told you something different. Okay, I can't say that enough. Gypsum is part of the question. Okay, so gypsum is recommended to help break up clay soils or create better drainage in clay soils. This is one of those internet things, or that's really run amok. I think if you go and watch YouTube videos with people using gypsum, or go to blog and read bloggers, you know how they use gypsum. It's just like this miracle thing that can break up all kinds of clay and create better drainage and blah 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 blah. It's because they read it from some other blogger, or watched some other YouTuber, or heard somebody else say this. It's not. This is the problem. Usually I don't get this animated, but changing soil chemistry, okay, is only to be done based on a soil test. Okay, do not add anything to your soil You see these videos, and it's kind of irritating as a YouTuber. If I put out a video tomorrow that was 10 uses for Epsom salts in the garden, it would get 100,000 views. I know it would. I could grow my channel much quicker by respouting blogger and YouTuber nonsense about, you know, the 10 great things that Epsom salts will cure, we can cure all our gardening woes with, when in fact Epsom salt is magnesium, and if your soil doesn't need magnesium, you could be harming it. The beginning of the video should say, after you've done a soil test and you decided that you needed Epsom salt, these are the things it could be helpful with, and maybe some problems that you've seen that need to be addressed. That would be a good gardening video, not add Epsom salt. And this is the same problem with gypsum. Gypsum in agriculture, in the world of agriculture, it's used to remove salt from soil. So soils that are closer to the coast, or out west, a lot of the land was below the ocean at some point, even if it's 5,000 feet above now. When soil that was below the ocean is raised up by mountains, and then it's in a desert where it hasn't rained and it hasn't had trees and things growing on it for some period of time, and it just hasn't rained enough, those soils can be saltier, and gypsum could be beneficial in those cases. It could be beneficial. It could be beneficial for old farm soils that have just really been worn out, the clay-based farm soils that have really, really been worn out. So it'll be recommended in those cases. But for the typical homeowner, if your soil is compact in the lawn, we can relieve a lot of that with core aeration, getting a core aerator or hiring someone to aerate your lawn. And then there are beds. Let's just use compost and mix that in as we plant. And that is plenty to alleviate compaction in the yard, unless, again, you get a soil test, and I think what is gypsum is calcium. I think it's just I can't remember the chemistry, but it is calcium. And so maybe if we needed calcium, that would be something, a way in which we could add calcium to the soil. So when I move into this new place, I'm going to do this soil test, and then I'm going to go through line item by line item, and tell you. I can actually know. I've done this long enough now. I'm in the southeast United States, and it rains heavy here, and it's hot in the summertime, and it's covered in, it's forested. And based on that information, I can actually tell you that we're phosphorus deficient, because phosphorus leaches easier. You can, I know certain things. If you told me that your area is dry, if you told me your area is cold in the cooler or moderate temperatures, maybe it's grasslands instead of forest, those kinds of things, I can actually probably be fairly accurate in what your soil test is going to say when it comes back, if you haven't done a lot to it already. And I'll show you that when I do my soil test, and I'll tell you how yours might differ and what you would add. But again, we're going to change soil based on science and not on YouTubers and internet bloggers and things like that, where they're just I think what's happening is they're reading somebody else's, and then it just becomes one thing after another. But I do not recommend putting down any thing that could change soil chemistry without first knowing what you're getting a soil test done. Okay, the other part of that that question, and I didn't mean to spend all that time on this one question, but I did want to be animated about people recommending things on YouTube and on blogs that change soil chemistry without telling that person they need to change to get a soil test is irresponsible, period. Okay, and then they wanted to know about planting King Tut grass. They're in zone 6B, it's not hardy there. That King Tut grass, which is beautiful, is an annual almost the entire country. I think South Florida, like a minor freeze, I think kills that King Tut grass. So like Southern California and South Florida and maybe the southern tip of Texas would be the only place where that would be a perennial. Everybody else, that's going to be an annual every year. And then they're talking about planting heucheras. Again, this is a foundation planting. And if you were to go in and add all that garden soil and all that stuff, then it probably would end up being too wet for heucheras. So that'd be another thing to be careful with in amending that soil. But basically, I'm telling you, without a soil test, everybody listening, put down if you're trying to redo a whole bed, put down a small amount of compost across the whole thing, and then it'll be mixed in as you plant each individual plant. Or do it plant by plant, mixing some compost in. And don't do anything else unless it's based on something else, and then keep it covered with mulch, but not so much mulch that it holds too much water. That's really the basics of this thing. There's really not much else than that. We want to mound things up a little bit, especially again near a foundation, because water can sit. The house, the shade and everything else can prevent that soil from draining. So mound them up a little bit. Only use a little bit of organic material. We don't want to run amok with it. And then mulch lightly so that we block weeds, we insulate the soil, but we don't hold too much water in place. And that's really the basics. And then through trial and error, things like heucheras that were asking that question can be temperamental, especially in different places in the country. So before you spend, some of these new heucheras and heucherellas can be $15 in a 1 gallon pot, maybe more. They're beautiful plants. I'd buy one and put it in that space and live with it for a season and make sure it performs well. That would be very heartbreaking to go buy 20 or 30 heucheras or heucherellas and then have them die because the space stays too wet or it doesn't drain well enough or that kind of thing. So that would be my recommendation on planting in a potentially wet, shady space. With expensive plants would be to be careful in purchasing too many at one time and then live with them for a season. Hosta was on that question as well. Hosta, just go for it. You're probably not going to hurt hosta. But anyway, sorry to spend that much time on that gypsum thing, but that just, I see it and it annoys me. It might be right for that person who's using it in the video, but it may or may not be right for you. So anyway, thank you very much for watching this. Please ask questions down below, and I will answer as many of them as I can. I came up short on answering a few this week, but I'll move to next week's. Thanks for watching.